What does a place become when it refuses the story we have prepared for it? Most of us move through the world with a quiet confidence. We trust the map, the measurement, the lesson learned in school. Water flows downhill. Fire belongs to flame and fuel. Sleep arrives in the dark and leaves with morning. A lake is a lake, a road is a road, and the earth beneath our feet is supposed to keep its promises. Yet scattered across this planet are places that unsettle those agreements. Not fantasy, not myth in the simple sense, real landscapes, studied and photographed, where reality seems to tilt just enough to remind us how partial our understanding still is. In the high mountains, a road appears to lift cars uphill against gravity. In a hidden valley, an ordinary park slips beneath clear green water and returns again, as if the seasons were rewriting the land. In desert grasslands, circles form with such precision they seem imagined by a patient, unseen hand. Far from volcanoes, a river runs hot enough to kill. Beneath ice, beneath rock, beneath memory itself, life persists in ways that challenge the boundaries we once drew around the possible. Scientists come to these places with instruments, data, and careful language. Local people often arrive with older names, older meanings, and a different kind of knowledge. Between them lies a tension that is as human as it is timeless. The wish to explain, and the equally human feeling that explanation is never the whole story. This is not a journey into the supernatural. It is something more interesting than that. It is a journey into the edges of certainty where wonder survives contact with fact. Because every so often, the world does not break its laws. It simply reveals that we have mistaken our current understanding for the final word. How easily can the eye betray the mind? At more than 11,000 feet in the thin air of northern India, the road between Leh and Kargil cuts through a landscape so vast it seems to erase ordinary scale. Brown mountains rise like broken walls. The sky feels close enough to touch. And along one strange stretch of pavement, travelers stop their engines, loosen their grip on certainty, and watch their vehicles begin to move. The motion is slow at first. A car left in neutral glides forward. A bus seems to creep against the logic of the slope. Water poured onto the asphalt appears to travel the wrong way. For a few suspended seconds, the body resists what the eyes insist is true. Everything in us says uphill should demand effort. Everything in front of us says otherwise. Places like this gather stories the way valleys gather wind. Some locals speak of divine pull, of a path favored by forces larger than human reasoning. Visitors laugh, then fall quiet. Even those who arrive knowing the scientific explanation often discover that knowledge does not fully protect perception. The mind may understand, but the senses keep arguing. The accepted answer is not magic, but geometry. The surrounding terrain bends the horizon. The ridgelines, the tilted land, the missing visual anchors all conspire to disguise a gentle decline as a rise. The car is not climbing at all. It is rolling downhill, exactly as physics says it should. What changes is not gravity, but our relationship to perspective. And that may be the more unsettling revelation. The mystery is not that nature has abandoned its laws. It is that our brains, so confident in their private theater of up and down, can be persuaded so completely by context. One, standing there, with the wind scraping over the mountains and the engine silent, it becomes clear that wonder does not always begin with the impossible. Sometimes it begins with the ordinary world, seen from an angle that makes us realize how often we mistake perception for truth. What if a place could live two separate lives and belong completely to both? In the mountains of Austria, there is a valley that spends part of the year behaving like a memory. In autumn and winter, it is a park like countless others, footpaths winding between trees, benches placed for quiet rest, wooden bridges crossing open ground. Hikers pass through without ceremony. Dogs pull at their leashes. Children run ahead. Nothing in the landscape suggests it is preparing to disappear. Then spring begins to loosen the snow high above. Meltwater gathers in the folds of the Hochschwab range and starts its patient descent. Day by day, the valley fills. Grass vanishes first, then trails, then benches, then the bridges themselves, until the familiar geometry of a public park lies beneath cold, astonishingly clear water. By the height of the flood, the transformation feels almost theatrical, as though the season has lowered a glass curtain over the land. Divers enter this temporary lake and move through a submerged world that looks both serene and slightly impossible. A park bench rests on the floor like a forgotten sentence. Tree trunks rise into green water. Paths remain visible below the surface, still tracing the routes of ordinary human movement, now surrendered to fish, light, and silence. It is not a ruin. It is not destruction. It is a rearrangement. The emerald color comes from the marriage of pure meltwater, sunlight, and drowned vegetation. Science explains the mechanism with ease. Snow melts, water pools, light refracts. Yet explanation does little to reduce the emotional effect of seeing a man-made landscape briefly reclaimed by something older and more fluid than design. And then, almost as quietly as it arrived, the water retreats. Summer restores the park. The benches dry. The paths return. People walk again where weeks earlier, divers floated. Perhaps that is why the place lingers in the imagination. It reminds us that permanence is often just timing. A bench, a bridge, a trail, even our best attempts to shape the land all remain subject to cycles far older than our plans. Some places do not choose between becoming and vanishing. They teach us that both can be forms of presence. Can a landscape look less like geology and more like a language we have forgotten how to read? In the dry interior of British Columbia, not far from the town of Osoyoos, there is a body of water that waits almost all year to reveal its true character. For months it can appear subdued, nearly ordinary, the kind of lake a traveler might notice only in passing. Then summer heat settles over the valley, the water begins to recede, and the surface breaks apart into a field of circles, so precise and so delicately colored that the earth seems to have turned to mosaic. The pools emerge one by one as evaporation concentrates the minerals held in the lake. Magnesium sulfate, calcium, sodium compounds, traces of metals, elements carried and gathered over long stretches of time. Each basin develops its own chemistry, and with it, its own hue. Some turn muted gold. Others glow green or blue. Thin ridges of crystallized minerals harden between them, forming natural pathways that divide the lake into dozens of rounded cells, like a giant painting left unfinished by weather. From a distance, the effect is almost unreal. The circles appear too intentional, too composed. Yet this beauty is not decorative. It is the visible result of processes unfolding with complete indifference to the human eye. Sun, wind, mineral content, and temperature do the work. The pattern changes across the season, never repeating itself in exactly the same way. The lake is stable in essence, but restless in appearance. For the Sialex people of the Okanagan, this place has long carried meaning deeper than appearance. Known as Kliluk, it is regarded as sacred, a site of healing and reverence. There are stories that each pool held its own medicinal character, and that even in times of conflict, people recognized the need to approach such a place with restraint. Long before scientific analysis named the compounds in the water, human attention had already recognized that the lake asked for respect. That may be the quiet lesson here. Not every mystery exists because we lack data. Some endure because a place can be chemically understood and still remain spiritually or emotionally unfinished. We measure the minerals, we describe the colors. But the deeper question remains, when the earth arranges itself into something this strange and beautiful, are we observing a phenomenon or encountering a form of meaning that science alone was never meant to hold? Why would a desert choose to draw circles? Across the grasslands of Namibia, where heat trembles above the ground and rain is never guaranteed, the land is marked by an eerie precision. Thousands upon thousands of bare rings interrupt the field, each one almost perfectly round, each one bordered by living grass as though the earth itself had set careful boundaries. From the air, they look deliberate. From the ground, they feel intimate and unsettling, like footprints left by a force too patient to be seen. These formations are known as fairy circles, though the name explains nothing. Inside each circle, the soil lies exposed. Around the edges, grasses often grow taller, stronger, greener, as if the emptiness in the center were somehow feeding life at the margins. They stretch for miles in repeating patterns, spaced with a consistency that makes chance feel inadequate. And for decades, researchers have stood before them with the uncomfortable recognition that no single explanation seems fully able to contain what they are seeing. One theory points to termites, tiny engineers of arid survival, clearing vegetation in ways that help trap moisture underground. Another argues for plant competition, a form of self-organization in which grasses, struggling for scarce water, arrange themselves into patterned spacing that benefits the whole field. Mathematical models can reproduce something similar. Ecologists can describe the advantages, and yet the real circles remain stubbornly more elegant, more exact, and more elusive than the theories built around them. They also possess a lifespan. Some endure for decades, fading only when grass slowly returns to claim the center. Others vanish sooner. New circles appear as old ones disappear, as if the desert is revising a manuscript no one else is allowed to read in full. The pattern persists, but the individual shapes come and go, temporary expressions of a deeper order. Perhaps that is what makes them so compelling. They sit at the meeting point of explanation and humility. We may understand part of the mechanism without possessing the whole meaning. We may simulate the pattern without fully grasping why nature chose this particular form, in this particular place, with such haunting consistency. In the end, the fairy circles ask a larger question than how they form. They ask why human beings are so moved when nature begins to resemble intention. What does it mean when sleep stops being rest and becomes a mystery no one can outrun? In a small village in Kazakhstan, daily life once moved with the modest rhythm common to rural places. Meals were cooked. Children went to school. People spoke in doorways, worked with their hands, and carried on with the quiet repetition that gives a community its shape. Then, without warning, something began to interrupt that rhythm. People started falling asleep, not in bed, not from fatigue, in the middle of conversation, while walking, while eating, while going about entirely ordinary moments. A person would simply collapse into a deep, unnatural sleep that could last for hours, sometimes days. When they woke, many described confusion so heavy it seemed to fog the world itself. Some had no memory of what had happened. Others reported dizziness, weakness, or vivid hallucinations that clung to them long after consciousness returned. What made the phenomenon so disturbing was not only its severity, but its refusal to follow any clear pattern. It affected children and adults, the healthy and the vulnerable, sometimes more than once, sometimes never again. One household might see repeated episodes while another nearby remained untouched. The village became a place where certainty had thinned. No one could know whether the next meal, the next errand, the next ordinary afternoon might end in days of lost time. Investigators searched for causes with the usual tools of modern explanation. Radiation was suspected because of the region's history. Toxic gases were considered. Air, soil, blood, and buildings were studied. Carbon monoxide offered part of a possible answer, but not enough. Too many details resisted it. Cases happened outdoors. Episodes occurred under conditions that theory could not neatly gather into one frame. A solution hovered, incomplete. And so the village entered that difficult territory where science is present, active, sincere, and still unable to close the case. Some residents left, others stayed, choosing familiarity over flight, home over certainty, even as home had become a place where consciousness itself seemed negotiable. There is something uniquely unsettling about a mystery that does not roar or burn or poison with visible force. Sleep is supposed to be the body's mercy. Here it arrived like an ambush. And perhaps that is why the story lingers, because it reminds us that the deepest fear is not always death or disaster, but the sudden loss of the self that knows where it is, what time it is, and how to return. What kind of fire waits for darkness before it reveals itself? On the eastern edge of Java, long before sunrise, the mountain is already awake. Hikers climb in silence with headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. The air sharpens as they rise. Stone shifts underfoot. And somewhere ahead, beyond the rim of the crater, the night begins to glow with a color that does not seem to belong to flame at all. It is blue. Not the soft blue of dawn, not the distant blue of ice or sky, but an electric, living blue that flickers from the earth itself. Inside the crater of Kawah Ijen, sulfurous gases escape through fractures in the rock at extreme temperatures. When those gases meet the air, they ignite. Molten sulfur can spill down the surface, still burning, creating the uncanny illusion of luminous rivers flowing through darkness. The chemistry can be described. Sulfur burns, gases ignite, temperature shapes color. Science accounts for the mechanism with calm precision, and yet witnessing the phenomenon is something else entirely. The mind accepts the explanation while the senses keep resisting it. Fire is not supposed to look like this. A volcano is not supposed to resemble a dream. As dawn approaches, another reality emerges. The blue flames begin to fade in the growing light, and the crater reveals the harshness hidden beneath the spectacle. At its center lies a lake of striking turquoise, beautiful from a distance, but so acidic it can burn skin and corrode metal. Men descend into this place to mine sulfur by hand, carrying staggering loads back up the crater wall through toxic fumes, often with little more than cloth over their faces. Their labor gives the mountain a human dimension that awe alone can easily overlook, and that is the tension Kawah Ijen holds so powerfully. It is at once a marvel of geology, a feat of chemistry, and a sight of exhausting human endurance. Beauty and danger do not take turns here. They stand side by side in the same breath. Perhaps that is why the volcano stays with those who see it. It reminds us that wonder is rarely pure. The things that dazzle us most are often bound to heat, cost, and fragility. The blue fire burns in the dark, but what it illuminates is more than a crater. It illuminates the uneasy distance between what we admire and what people must endure to stand inside it. What can survive in a place cut off from the sun, the wind, and almost every story we tell about life? In Antarctica's McMurdo dry valleys, the landscape seems stripped down to its oldest elements: ice, rock, silence, and a cold so complete it feels beyond emotion. Along the face of Taylor Glacier, amid all that white and stillness, a dark red stain appears to spill from the frozen wall. It looks at first like an injury in the ice, a wound that never closes. Against the pale glacier, the color is so startling that the mind searches instinctively for the wrong explanations. For years, people did just that. Some assumed the red came from algae or surface contamination, something simple enough to fit the eye's first impression. The truth turned out to be far stranger and in its way more beautiful. Deep beneath the glacier lies a reservoir of ancient brine, trapped under ice for an unimaginably long span of time. The water is rich in iron, and so salty that it remains liquid in conditions that would freeze ordinary water solid. When that hidden brine finds its way upward through narrow fissures and reaches the oxygen of the open air, the iron begins to oxidize. It rusts almost immediately, staining the outflow a deep blood red as it spreads over the glacier's face. What seems at first like bleeding is in fact chemistry unfolding in slow motion, a meeting between a buried world and the atmosphere it has been denied for ages. But the real astonishment lies below the surface. Inside that isolated, lightless reservoir, microbial life has endured without sunlight and without oxygen, sustained by chemical processes that would once have seemed too alien to imagine. These organisms do not rely on the same energy pathways that dominate the surface world. They inhabit a system that has remained sealed and self-contained on timescales that dwarf human history. That discovery changed more than our understanding of one Antarctic glacier. It widened the frame of what life itself might be. If living systems can persist in darkness, cold, and isolation beneath Earth's ice, then perhaps worlds that once felt empty to us are only empty because we were asking the wrong questions. Blood Falls is a dramatic name, but the deeper story is quieter. It is about endurance, about hidden worlds, about the humbling possibility that life does not need our preferred conditions in order to begin, continue, and wait patiently to be found. How does a place become so dangerous that even standing still beside it can be fatal? In the southern Ural Mountains, there is a lake that no longer behaves like a lake in any ordinary sense. It does not invite reflection, fishing, birdsong, or weathered boats tied to shore. It exists instead as a warning held in geography, a body of water so altered by human ambition that its very presence feels accusatory. Lake Karachay is small, almost modest on a map. Yet for a time it became one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Its transformation began not with nature, but with secrecy. During the Soviet era, radioactive waste from the Mosaic nuclear facility was discharged into the lake as if water were simply an empty container, as if distance and silence could absorb consequence. The contamination accumulated year after year, invisible at first in the way the gravest damage so often is. Radiation does not announce itself in color or sound. It enters quietly, altering cells, time, and futures. The numbers alone are difficult to absorb. Exposure near the shore could deliver a lethal dose in a shockingly short period. Yet the greater tragedy was never confined to a single edge of water. When drought lowered the lake in the 1960s, contaminated sediments were exposed to the wind, and radioactive dust traveled outward across the surrounding region, reaching people who may never have heard the lake's name, but would nonetheless live inside its aftermath. Eventually, engineers tried to bury the danger beneath concrete and stone, reducing the chance that the poisoned sediment would rise again into the air. But covering a wound is not the same as healing it. Contamination seeped into groundwater. The problem changed form, but did not vanish. That is often the true shape of environmental catastrophe. Not an event that ends, but a condition that lingers. Unlike the mysteries of strange rivers or hidden caves, this place offers no comforting sense of wonder. Its mystery is moral rather than scientific. How could so much damage be permitted? How often do human systems mistake control for wisdom? And what does it mean to create something that remains hazardous longer than memory itself? Lake Karachai reminds us that the impossible is not always beautiful. Sometimes the most haunting landscapes are the ones that reveal, with terrible clarity, what happens when human power outruns human humility. What kind of world can remain hidden for millions of years and still be full of life? Near the Romanian city of Mangalia, a narrow opening in the ground once led scientists into a place that felt less like a cave than a sealed chapter of Earth's past. The air itself was hostile. Oxygen was scarce. Carbon dioxide was dangerously high. Hydrogen sulfide lingered in concentrations that made each breath a calculated risk. Nothing about the environment suggested comfort, balance, or the familiar generosity of surface life. And yet life was there. Movil Cave had been isolated from the outside world for an immense span of time, long enough for entire evolutionary stories to unfold in darkness. No sunlight reached inside. No green plants anchored the food chain. No seasons passed through to organize the days. The ecosystem had developed apart from the rhythms that govern nearly everything we know above ground, as though the cave had been allowed to invent its own rules while the rest of the planet carried on elsewhere. What scientists found was astonishing not because it was large, but because it was complete. Microbes formed the base of the system, drawing energy not from light, but from chemical reactions involving sulfur and methane. On that hidden foundation lived a community of creatures found nowhere else. Blind spiders, pale scorpions, strange insects and worms adapted to air that would quickly overwhelm human lungs. Predators hunted prey. Life fed on life. A whole web of existence persisted in a world without sunrise. The cave changed more than a few textbook assumptions. It forced a deeper revision in how we imagine habitability itself. For generations, sunlight had seemed almost synonymous with life. Movil Cave offered a different possibility. It suggested that biology is more inventive than our categories, and that living systems may emerge wherever energy, chemistry, and time find a way to cooperate. That realization extends far beyond Romania. The cave has become a model for places beyond Earth, especially hidden oceans and subsurface worlds where light never reaches. If life can flourish in toxic darkness here, then perhaps the universe is not waiting for gardens and blue skies. Perhaps it has been building quiet ecosystems in places we once dismissed as impossible. Movil Cave is difficult to enter and easy to romanticize, but its deepest message is simple. Life does not merely endure favorable conditions. Given enough time, it learns how to make a home inside the unimaginable. What kind of river carries heat like a secret too old for maps? Deep in the Peruvian Amazon, where distance is measured less by miles than by effort, the jungle opens around a body of water that seems to violate the logic of its own existence. Steam rises through the trees. The banks sweat with heat. The river moves with the ordinary shape of a river, winding through forest and stone. Yet the water is so hot that it can scald, maim, and kill. This is Shinai Timpishka, often called the Boiling River, and even now it resists easy explanation. To stand near it is to feel the body argue with the mind. Rivers belong to rain, to runoff, to the patient pull of gravity toward lower ground, to Baman. They do not usually carry temperatures associated with the kettles and vents. In volcanic regions, extreme heat has a familiar geological story, but here, far from the nearest active volcanoes, that story begins to break apart. The river seems to have arrived from outside the expected order. Local indigenous communities have known this place for generations, not as a curiosity, but as part of a living spiritual landscape. In their understanding, the river is not merely hot water. It is presence, force, warning, and reverence braided together. Long before geoscientists came with thermometers and notebooks, the river had already been named, respected, and folded into a larger relationship between land, heat, and meaning. Modern research offers a partial answer. Rainwater may descend through deep faults in the earth, heat under pressure, and return to the surface through fractures that feed the river from below. It is a plausible mechanism, and yet the scale remains startling. The volume of hot water, the consistency of the temperatures, and the river's persistence all push at the edges of what that explanation can comfortably hold. Science has not failed here. It is simply not finished. And perhaps that unfinished quality is what gives the river its power over the imagination. It is lethal, yes, but it is also instructive. It reminds us that some truths arrive first as experience and only later as theory. A place can be observed, measured, partially understood, and still retain a core of mystery. The boiling river does not ask us to abandon reason. It asks something harder, to let knowledge and wonder stand side by side without forcing either one to disappear. Why do we keep traveling toward places that unsettle us? After the maps are folded away and the photographs go dim, what remains is not only the image of a boiling river or a cave without sunlight. What remains is the pattern connecting them. Again and again, human beings are drawn to edges, the edge of explanation, the edge of danger, the edge of what our senses can trust. We say we are searching for answers, and often we are. But beneath that search is something older and more intimate. We are also searching for proportion. A road that appears to ignore gravity, a park that drowns and returns, a desert that arranges itself into circles, a glacier that spills red from hidden depths. Each place interrupts the ordinary scale of human confidence, not by humiliating us, but by gently removing the illusion that the world has already been fully translated into language. We live surrounded by systems we believe we understand. Then a landscape appears and reminds us that understanding is never the same thing as completion. There is also a human story inside every one of these locations. Miners carry sulfur through toxic air. Villagers sleep without warning and wake without memory. Scientists lower instruments into inhospitable terrain, not because certainty is guaranteed, but because the unknown continues to call. Indigenous communities preserve names and meanings long before outsiders arrive with formal models. In each case, the place is never just a phenomenon. It is also a relationship between people and mystery. That may be why such places endure in cultural memory. They offer more than spectacle. They restore a kind of balance. In a world saturated with explanation, they give us back the experience of encountering something that cannot be reduced in a single glance or a single sentence. They ask for patience. They ask for humility. They ask us to admit that awe is not a failure of intelligence, but one of its most honest expressions. Perhaps that is the quiet purpose of the impossible places on earth. Not to defeat reason, but to keep it human. To remind us that knowledge grows best when it is accompanied by wonder, and that the world is still large enough to resist becoming merely familiar. What do these places reveal about us when we stop asking only how they work and begin asking why they matter? There is a temptation, when confronted with extraordinary landscapes, to treat them as puzzles waiting to be solved and then set aside. Once the mechanism is named, we imagine the mystery has been cleared. But that is rarely how experience works. Knowing that a hill is an optical illusion does not fully quiet the strange feeling of watching a car roll where it should not. Understanding the chemistry of blue fire does not make the crater less haunting. Learning how iron turns Antarctic water red does not diminish the unease of seeing what looks like blood pour from ancient ice. Facts matter. They matter deeply. They protect us from superstition masquerading as certainty, and they allow us to approach the world with discipline rather than fantasy. Yet facts are not the opposite of wonder. In their best form, they deepen it. A sealed cave where life survives without sunlight is not less astonishing, because microbes and gases can be measured. A river heated through hidden geological pathways is not less powerful because researchers can propose a model. Explanation does not close the world. It opens it further. What changes, perhaps, is the quality of our attention. We begin by looking at these places as spectacles. Then, if we are careful, we start to see them as mirrors. They reflect our assumptions back to us. How quickly we mistake familiarity for mastery, how often we divide science from reverence, as if human beings were required to choose between them. Again and again, these landscapes suggest a gentler truth. We can investigate without arrogance. We can feel awe without surrendering judgment. That is especially important now, in an age that rewards immediacy and certainty. The impossible places of Earth resist both. They do not offer themselves all at once. They require context, patience, and the willingness to let a question remain open a little longer than comfort prefers. And maybe that is their hidden gift. They teach us that maturity is not the end of wonder, but its refinement. Not the hunger to be dazzled, but the ability to stand before something real, complicated, and only partly understood, and to call that encounter meaningful without demanding it become simple. In the end, the strangest places on Earth do not merely challenge science. They deepen it. They remind us that knowledge is not a monument we finish, but a path we keep walking. Every generation inherits a world that seems increasingly measured, increasingly mapped, increasingly explained. Satellites circle overhead. Sensors reach into oceans, glaciers, deserts, and caves. We can name minerals, track fault lines, model weather, and sequence the hidden machinery of life. And still, the planet retains its ability to surprise us. Not because science is weak, but because reality is richer than any single moment of understanding. That may be the most hopeful truth in this journey. The unknown is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the conversation between humanity and the world is still alive. A road in the mountains confuses the eye, a valley becomes a lake, and then returns to itself. Circles appear in the desert with an order that feels almost intentional. Villagers surrender to unexplained sleep. Blue fire rises from a volcanic darkness. Ancient red water escapes from beneath Antarctic ice. A poison lake warns us what human ambition can do when separated from restraint. In a sealed cave, life invents a way forward without sunlight. In the Amazon, a river carries heat through the forest like a message from the deep earth. Each place is different in cause, in scale, in meaning. Yet together they form a single meditation on humility. We are a species that longs to know. That longing has built observatories, microscopes, libraries, and voyages into places once thought unreachable. It has also given us stories, rituals, and the instinct to listen when a landscape feels older than our language for it. Perhaps wisdom lies not in choosing one mode over the other, but in letting them travel together. Measurement beside reverence, evidence beside wonder. Because the world is not diminished when we understand more of it. It becomes more intimate, more intricate, more alive. And maybe that is the final question these places leave with us. Not whether the earth still holds mysteries, but whether we can remain the kind of people who know enough to explain and still stay humble enough to be amazed.